Warning, censorship. Warning, censorship.
Keean Bexte, Rebel News.
A question to the Premier, thanks for taking it. Can Albertans take this as sort of a signal that the government is looking to put COVID sort of behind you and start dealing with the policy and legislation and campaign promises that you made 2 or 3 years ago? It is now, I suppose. Is this a signal that you're looking to sort of reset?
Well, I wouldn't say reset, because in fact this is implementing part of our original agenda, and I would say that we have never stopped with that, right? Last year, Alberta's legislature sat far longer, far more days, and passed far more bills than any legislature in Canada, and significantly more than the federal parliament.
Keean Bexte for Rebel News here at the Alberta Legislature to cover a pretty significant event in the term of Jason Kenney's first term as Premier here in Alberta. Jason Kenney's government is moving forward on recall legislation. That is legislation that hardcore conservatives in the province have been fighting for decades, and that's not an exaggeration. This has been something that the Wild Rose Party actually was fighting for a very long time ago. Currently the Minister of Heritage and Culture, Leela here, was fighting for that when she was in opposition as a Wild Rose MLA, and now in government, the Jason Kenney Alberta government is moving forward with recall legislation allowing for constituents in any constituency, whether it is a provincial constituency or school board trustee position or a city councillor position or a mayor seat. Of course, this doesn't include anything federal, but it allows constituents to recall their elected officials if they don't think that they are performing up to par, up to the standards that Albertans expect of them. Now, the specifics of this, Jason Kenney goes into it a little bit in a press conference that I spoke to him at today. He says that 40% of the eligible voters in a constituency will be required to sign a recall document, and once that's been signed, it will trigger the process. I'll let him put it in his own words. Here's what he had to say today.
In the last election, we committed to the most dramatic democratic reforms in Alberta history, to put Alberta voters in the driver's seat, to make it clear that at the end of the day, ordinary Alberta voters are the boss in our democracy. And if they lose faith in their elected representatives, that they can hold them to account in between elections. That's why we made a commitment to bring in a recall law that allows voters effectively to fire their elected representatives if they break public confidence. And so today we are introducing that legislation, keeping that commitment. This legislation will not only cover members of the Alberta legislature, but also elected members of municipal councils, because local property owners and voters deserve the same kind of accountability from their local councillors, mayors, and reeves. And it will also apply to elected members of school boards across Alberta if they should do something that causes a loss of faith with their constituents, their electorate.
Now, surprisingly, I was actually able to ask the Premier 2 questions today, and I asked questions about recall legislation, about this major campaign promise. I asked him if he thought that maybe COVID was finally going to be behind us, if he was going to be putting the COVID agenda in the back seat, or if he would be sort of resetting the agenda to start governing strictly on what he campaigned on to get into the current seat that he's in now as Premier of Alberta. And he said that they've not really been as distracted as I kind of thought that they were. Here's what he had to say.
Keean Bexte, Rebel News.
A question to the Premier, thanks for taking it. Can Albertans take this as sort of a signal that the government is looking to put COVID sort of behind you and start dealing with the policy and legislation and campaign promises that you made 2 or 3 years ago? It is now, I suppose. Is this a signal that you're looking to sort of reset?
Well, I wouldn't say reset, because in fact this is implementing part of our original agenda, and I would say that we have never stopped with that, right? Last year, Alberta's legislature sat far longer, far more days, and passed far more bills than any legislature in Canada, and significantly more than the federal parliament. Now, a lot of that was COVID-related actions, policies, legislation, funding, etc. But an awful lot of it was grinding through the implementation of the huge and detailed platform we ran on in the 2019 election. At last count, I believe we have now substantially or completely implemented nearly 75% of the platform commitments we ran on. I'll tell you that it was originally our intention to like our first year was obviously focused on economic priorities. That was the key theme on which we ran in the last election. We had originally planned to go forward with some of the democratic reform items in the spring of 2020. But obviously we got sideswiped by COVID. The legislature sittings were disrupted. We had to bring in different kinds of emergency legislation. And quite frankly, I don't think Albertans would have understood the government talking about issues like democratic reform at the height of the pandemic. So we then said, okay, well, we want to get moving on this stuff. That's why we appointed the special legislature committee chaired by Joe Scow there to consult Albertans per our platform commitment, and now bringing forward the legislation. So I wish this had come forward about a year ago, but I also wish COVID didn't happen and it hadn't become a huge focus, of course, for our energies in the past year. So you'll see more of the kind of commitments in the platform coming forward in this spring session. And we hope that by June, that will be edging close to 90% implementation of the platform.
Now, I also asked him about an MLA that was in his caucus, MLA Pat Rain. He is the MLA for Lesser Slave Lake, and he was kicked out of governing caucus because apparently he wasn't performing up to the standards that the Premier and his constituents expected of him. So I asked the Premier, Jason Kenney, if he would be supporting a recall campaign against this former UCP MLA. And while he said that he wouldn't be supporting it specifically as the leader of the province, that many people in that constituency have been gunning to push this. They've been pushing the government to pass this legislation so that they could start this recall plan. Here's what he had to say to my question. Now, you did mention that you hope to have this sort of rolling by the time during this legislature. So, because you made some pretty condemning statements about your former MLA from Lesser Slave Lake, would you support a recall campaign to remove that former UCP MLA? And I only ask because of the statements you made about the quality of his work output.
You know what? I'm not going to. That's for his constituents. Recall is between constituents and their representative, not for me as a leader of a party that he's not in our caucus. So it's totally up to his constituents. I do know that a couple of the town councils in his riding actually passed motions last fall calling on the government to expedite adoption of the recall law because they wanted to trigger it with respect to their local MLA. So. If you want an opinion on that, if I were you, I'd call the mayors of Slave Lake or High Prairie and see what they think about that.
So here I am walking around the rotunda of the legislature, and I know that the Minister of Justice, Casey Madhu, is about to step out of the Premier's office after a press conference that he just held. I'm going to ask him a few questions. So you made the announcement today about recall legislation. Can you tell me, are you expecting anyone to be recalled in this term?
Well, I think it would be up to the Albertans who live in a particular constituency. This bill will allow constituents, to initiate that particular process. So I'm going to leave it in their hands.
Now, I was really happy that we were able to ask two questions of the Premier today, and I also asked questions of the Justice Minister after this press conference. I'm really glad that we were able to do that. I think that we ask questions that the mainstream media would never consider asking, and I think that we get answers that Albertans and Canadians really need to hear. Now, it was a long struggle to actually get into this legislature. I don't know if you're following the legal fight that we had, but it was long and it was costly. If you go to letusreport.ca, you'll be able to see all of the work that it took to get us into this legislature, to get Rebel News into this legislature and accredited by the Speaker so that we could ask questions in press conferences like this and ask questions of MLAs, whether they're in government or opposition. If you go there and help pitch into the fund so that we can pay back the lawyers, the bill is still there, we're still paying it. If you want to help pay back our lawyers so that we can continue doing stuff just like this, it would be much appreciated. For Rebel News in the Alberta Legislature, I'm Keean Bexte. Like I said, if you want to go to letusreport.ca and check out all of the nonsense, really, that we had to go through to get here, to get standing where I am standing and ask the questions that I was able to ask today, please go to letusreport.ca and check that out.